Don't be a coward. It's 3 days. We stand to make more money than you're likely to see in your whole career. I just need you to run a camera." Wayne was quiet for a few minutes, and Terry could tell he was going to waffle. That was when he decided to sweeten the pot. "If we actually see the thing, I'll give you an extra $3,000. That was all Wayne needed to hear. "Okay, but this better not be a waste of my time. The boss is already going to kill me for taking off on short notice." Terry grinned to himself. "Trust me, Wayne, by Monday morning, we'll all have more cash than we know what to do with." He hung up, Wayne's farewell cut off as he set about calling Scully. Sandra Lewis, Scully to her friends, was probably one of the best techs Terry had ever met. She'd been a skinny little redhead with thick glasses and a love of gadgets, and Terry had seen more than just a quick sexual conquest with some pretty clear daddy issues. They'd been friends since college, and 20 years later, they were still the heart and soul of his team. If he was going to go to Jeremiah, he wanted both of them. Scully picked up on the third ring, and Terry could almost hear the Marlboro she was eating for dinner in a series of long pulls. "This better be good, Terry. I'm working on some footage for a client, and let's just say it's not the kind of thing you want to get sloppy with." Terry squashed the urge to ask and powered ahead. "Clear your calendar this weekend. We're going to Jeremiah." He was answered by a long, crispy sound as she pulled more tar into her lungs before answering him. "And what in God's name makes you think I'd ever want to set foot in that place again?" "Come on, Scully. No other news outlets have managed to get past the police barricades. And my producer says if I can get some footage from inside the town, he'll lay down some hard cash for the recording. Not to mention, I can sell them to the other outlets once we're done, too. There's a lot of edits to be made, Skull, and I know you got bills to pay, same as me. You ever stop to ask yourself why the cops won't let anyone into town? Who knows? I assume they just want to cover up their incompetence. They haven't managed to find anything, and they're afraid of being embarrassed. If the police for 3 counties and the state boys can't find 6 missing kids, what makes you think we can?" "Well, 3 missing," Terry said, swallowing hard as he thought about the reports his editor had handed him. "The boys were, well, let's just say they aren't missing anymore. The morgue has a pretty good idea of where they're at." "Jesus, Terry, and you want us to walk into that? What the hell makes you think I would go in there with you?" "I'm hoping the same deal that got Wayne to go in there. $3,000 for the weekend, $3,000 if we get footage of something that helps us figure out what happened to those girls." There was a pause, and a small curse as Scully hastily put out her cigarette. $6,000? I'm guessing you're going to need my equipment too, so you better go ahead and make it 8. $8,000? Terry balked, seeing his overhead dwindling. The station had promised to compensate him big, but 6 to Wayne and 8 to Scully was pretty big on its own. Terry would be left with the bones and the gristle at this rate, but some of those bones might have marrow in them. Marrow that Terry could turn into something for his joke of a career. Consider the other 2 a rental fee, and God help you if any of my shit gets broken. Some of this equipment ain't cheap, and it sounds like you're going to be hauling it through the woods to get there. Fine, Terry said, you can have 8, but 3 of that hinges on your ability to get me some solid evidence of what's taken these kids. With our luck, it's just a pissed-off bear down in the mine shafts trying to mind its own business. Let's hope so, Terry said. I don't recall us getting chased off 20 years ago by a bear, though. There was a pregnant silence, broken only by the snick of the lighter as Scully tried to light a fresh cigarette. I'll see you Friday, Terry. I assume we're meeting at Dolly's beforehand to discuss logistics. Of course. All bad decisions start with a slice of pie at Dolly's, and end with a cup of coffee after we get bailed out of jail. They talked a little more about meet times, and what Terry would need from her, and when he hung up a few minutes later, he pumped his arm like a kid that's just found a sure thing. Terry turned to the wall of his office, little more than a mop closet with a desk shoved into it, and glowered at the map of Jeremiah he had tacked up there. The map was little more than an aerial photo Terry had scribbled landmarks onto. No recent maps of Jeremiah actually existed. The town had been abandoned since '85, under very mysterious circumstances, and maps were usually only for places where people lived. Anyone not living in town had simply pulled up stakes and moved away from Jeremiah. Terry had taken more than a dozen statements from people who remembered the place, and while most were from ladies and gents old enough to remember a time before sliced bread, they all agreed on one thing. They had left after the town's residents disappeared because they just didn't feel safe anymore. They couldn't say why. No one thing stood out, but the feeling of otherworldly dread that slid out of Jeremiah like a fell miasma made them believe they might be better off in Young Harris, or Tekoa, or even Kashmir. Terry had been obsessed with the secrets surrounding Jeremiah since he was a kid, and it seemed like this weekend might be the climax of his life's work. You'd be forgiven for not knowing where Jeremiah, Georgia is. Most school children in the area consider it little more than an urban legend, but it was real. The town was founded in the mid-1800s after Jeremiah's Folly, a large mine that mostly dealt in iron ore, found a large deposit of some odd gems. Terry had seen fragments in the Dahlonega Mineral Museum, and they were a strange mixture of several different stones. The jewelers loved them because the cuts were unlike anything they had ever seen, and the more popular they became, the deeper they mined looking for them. The cave-in 1918 had been expected, but had still devastated the industry in town. They had simply dug too deep. Everyone said so. The ground was tired of giving, and had decided to take a little back. It started with sea level, 3 miles down, and just as they were clearing the debris to rescue the miners, the level above sea level had also collapsed, killing hundreds. By the end of the day, 3 other levels had collapsed, and more than 400 miners had been lost. Those trapped in the lower levels were lost as well, and after a lengthy rescue, the mines were closed, and the project was abandoned. The town had shrunk after that, becoming more of a ghost town than anything, and the population had shrunk to a few hundred. That was until Morgan Gould had bought the land in '59. He wanted the mines more than anything, and started reopening the tunnels so he could start mining again. Terry had never spoken to any of the miners in the early days. Most of the ones who had survived the collapse in 1918 had been old back then, but he had spoken to a few of the miners from the '59 project. They talked about throwing up supports and cleaning out the tunnels as they unearthed the lower levels. They said the whole place was spooky. There were weird noises that never seemed to have a source, strange lights that led off to nowhere, and several counts of missing miners that were never counted for. The mine bosses always talked about men who disappeared in the middle of the night, but the men he'd spoken with had said that many of those men had good work ethics and wouldn't have just gone off in the middle of the night. One of them, Marcus Wedge, had talked about clearing the debris from D-level and hearing something like insects as he dug. It was the sound them cicadas make, that high-pitched ree sound. I looked around, wondering how any bug could make it this deep, but I saw nothing but flickering lights and electric lamps. This wasn't like modern days, neither. Those lights were dodgy, and if they went out, you were in a world of trouble. Gould had been working on a lift system, too, doing away with the track system that had been in place. And I remember one time that lift went out and had 3 of us hung up between C and D level. Kyle Jernigan was complaining about quotas and getting hollered at, so I got on my belly to see if I could see into D level. We were right around the ceiling, and I could see something in the winking lights. It was moving along that ceiling, its body like tar, and as it rounded the corner, it turned its head to look at me and smiled. It had a mouth full of perfect teeth, and as I stood there, the car shook and started moving again. I worked them mines for another year until I got stuck down there in a blackout and nearly had a nervous breakdown. It was me and Tommy and Rolf down there, clearing a tunnel to get to E level. Suddenly, all the lights went out, and we were left in total darkness. As I stood there, waiting for them to come back on, I could feel something moving around. I remembered that dark thing I thought I'd seen, almost thought I could see that grin in the blackness, and I got down on my knees and started praying for God to protect me. I don't know if he did or not, but when the lights came back up, Tommy and me was still there, but Rolf was gone. I went to the paymaster that day and told him I was done. He handed me my check and told me he'd see me in a couple of weeks. I went to Clayton and got work at the gas station there and never saw the mine again. When I heard about what happened to the town 20 years later, it didn't really surprise me none. Terry had heard similar stories, but he didn't really believe any of them. Sure, he and his friends had seen something there when they were in college, but he refused to get spooked because of some superstitious minors. They would go in there and get some footage of something and get paid accordingly. Terry grabbed his coat and headed for the door. He needed to get his ducks in a row before he met with Wayne and Scully. He needed gas in the van to get the parts for the equipment, charge up the portable batteries. He stepped out into the hallway and almost rolled right over Dale, who'd been standing down by the break room. "Where's the fire, Spooky?" he asked, and Terry paused to mumble a quick apology. "You got a little kid's costume contest to cover?" Terry narrowed his eyes and bit his lip before he let it get the better of him. He hated Dale, but he was technically higher than him in the station's food chain. Dale Corsi was the field reporter for the 6 to 6 night shift, the same shift that Terry reported on, but he was tasked with more pressing stories. They sent Dale and his perfectly coiffed brown hair if they had a forest fire to cover or a standoff at the bank. If there was a report of a Bigfoot sighting or a strange plane, then they sent Terry out because they knew he loved that sort of coverage. This had given Terry a little bit of a reputation for covering oddities, and his co-workers used it as an excuse to hassle him. Dale was one of the worst offenders, but Terry didn't have time for him today. "I'm busy, Dale, so if you don't mind." "Oh no, an emergency call? What, did someone see a Wendigo at the Five Guys? Witches eating kids in the park again?" Terry started to bristle, but pushed it down. By the end of the weekend, he'd wiped the smile off of Dale's face for good. "Not at liberty to say, Dale. I'm kind of in a crunch, though, so I gotta go." The sound of derisive laughter followed him as Terry went to the parking lot to get his van. He had a lot to do before tomorrow. He could see Wayne and Scully waiting in the back booth of Dolly's when he arrived the next day. It was mid-morning, and the place was dead except for a few oldsters in trucker caps drinking coffee. His friends stuck out like a sore thumb in their heavy coats and dark expressions. The waitress kept looking at Scully darkly, and Terry could already see the curl of smoke rising from her cigarette. If Scully was awake, she was smoking, and even Miss Grace couldn't dissuade her from it. The bell rang as Terry came in, and Miss Grace smiled as she came over to give him a hug. "Terry Flowers, as I live and breathe. I'd hoped you'd be joining your surly friends. The usual?" "Yes, ma'am," Terry said, already tasting the hash browns as they softened under the warm blanket of gravy. He added coffee and orange juice to his order and went to join his friends. Scully looked up as Terry approached, and Wayne lifted his coffee cup to blow the steam off before sipping. Terry took a seat across from them. He had them on the line. Now it was time to reel them in. "So, any questions before we get started?" "Did you bring the money?" Wayne asked, and Scully tapped her cigarette on the dish as she raised an eyebrow at him. Terry rolled his eyes and reached in as he pulled out 2 envelopes, tossing them on the table. "Half now and half Sunday." They took their envelopes and tucked them away, turning to listen to Terry as he spread out a copy of the map he had made. It was smaller than the one in his office, about the size of a placemat, and Terry had all the appropriate landmarks clearly labeled. Their starting point seemed to be an access road about 2 miles out, and Terry tapped it on the map. "We'll come in here and hike into town." Once inside, he moved his finger to the outskirts where an X labeled Fill and Go stood. "We'll set up here and start our investigation. It's close to the Gould Mining Company, and it'll give us a spot to investigate the rest of the town from, too. We'll ideally spend 2 to 3 nights there, leaving Sunday so we can go over to the data Monday morning." "What exactly is the story here, Terry?" Wayne asked. "Information about the missing teens. The police still haven't found them, and the TikTok Heather Jones was making when she disappeared leads people to think that the mines was the last location they were seen. The police and the Park Service had searched the mines, but after the 3rd person went missing down there, police pulled their guys back to the city limits and set up a perimeter to keep others out while they investigated." "And if the cops come and drag our asses out?" Wayne asked. Terry shook his head. "It'll never come to that, Wayne. We'll be in and out before anyone's the wiser. We can stay hidden in the old Fill and Go and take our little scouting trips into town when we need to. We can trek in early so we can avoid any patrols. We can get in and set up before lunch, and our small group will make it easier to hide. We set out tomorrow at dawn. I'd suggest you stay at my place tonight so we can leave before first light tomorrow. Questions?" Scully shook her head, but Wayne seemed intent on talking himself out of this. "Does this have anything to do with what happened when we were in college?" Terry chewed his lip. I really hope not. Jeremiah's a place where people go missing sometimes, where a whole town went missing once. And it sounds a lot like the kids that went missing 20 years ago when we first went to investigate. I'm not willing to rule it out, but I really hope not. Thinking about whatever had stalked them and chased them out of Jeremiah that day, the streetlights flickering as they ran for their lives, filled Terry with dread. He understood Wayne's hesitation. Jeremiah was the last place he wanted to find himself, but there was something there, and Terry had to know. At his core, Terry was just a nosy kid looking for secrets to tell his friends. It was what had brought him into journalism. It was what kept him in the game. I'm leaving in the morning, with or without you guys. If you're coming, I'll gladly take you. If not, then I guess I'll do it on my own. Either way, I'm going back to Jeremiah. The two of them stared at him for a second before Scully snorted and tossed the crust of her toast at him. You're so dramatic, Terry. Of course we'll go with you. You've already paid us, you moron. Plus, Wayne added, if you head in there and don't come back, we'll never forgive ourselves. Terry smiled, glad he had brought them in. If there were two people that he could believe in, it was these two. They'd follow him to hell and back, or possibly preparing to do just that, and if he had to go into Jeremiah, these were the two he trusted the most. He put his hand on the table, something the three of them had done when they were younger, and he was unsurprised to see them stack theirs on top of his. Let's figure out exactly what we'll need and get a good night's sleep tonight. Tomorrow, we're heading back to Jeremiah. Sounds of early morning surrounded them as Terry and his team got ready to set out. The access road had been half hidden by a fall of limbs and leaves, but it was all camouflage. His contact had told him to put the cover back when he was done, so before rolling down the dirt road, they had slid everything back into place for the next person that needed to get to Jeremiah. The trees were close to the van, and Terry rolled the window down to pull his mirror in before asking Scully to do the same. She had taken the front seat, Wayne sitting in the back with the gear, and he was currently trying to keep it all from sliding around in the back of the bumpy van. Terry watched as the trees pressed in around them, making his drive feel claustrophobic. This was all starting to have a very Blair Witch vibe going to it, and he was hoping for a different result from last time. Of course, the whole thing felt a little bit like an urban legend the more you looked into Jeremiah. After the mine had collapsed, people started going missing. Only a few at first, the owner of the hardware store, a cab driver taking someone home, a waitress at the local diner, the principal at the high school, and the second deputy of the local sheriff. No one really looked into it. People left Jeremiah for better prospects, and the town had a history of people just picking up roots. Then, one day, the whole town just disappeared. It started out as absenteeism for those who didn't work in town. A nurse who worked at the hospital in Kashmir never showed up for her shift. Several students who attended the Clarksville Technical College missed a few days of school. A teacher from the Clayton Elementary School, with a perfect attendance record, hadn't called in a sub for that day. When people called the truant individuals and received no answer, they called the police in Jeremiah. When emergency services never responded, they called their local law enforcement for help. When the state police went in to see what had happened, the entire population of Jeremiah was nowhere to be found. They found no evidence of foul play, not a single thing out of place at all, aside from a few disrupted rooms, and the homes had things set out for the following day. Clothes were laid out, lunches packed, important things set aside so they could be easily picked up the next morning. It seemed like everyone had gone to bed with the inclination of waking up the next day, and just disappeared in the night. It was a mystery that no one had ever found an answer to, and it led to interested people coming to Jeremiah to this day. The town remained abandoned, and anyone who lived there never stayed for long. They either moved after reporting strange occurrences, or they simply disappeared. The city of Kashmir had talked about tearing the town down, but the city had been declared a historic site after the mine collapsed. They couldn't just get rid of it, so they blocked the only road in an attempt to keep people out. An attempt that had little result. When Terry was a kid, lots of people had gone there, and most of them had come back unscathed. Dust puffed up as Terry put on the brakes, the road coming to an abrupt end. "Let's get moving," he said. taking the window cover out of the back as he reached for the bag. "We've got a lot of ground to cover before noon." "You know what direction we're heading, right?" Scully asked, climbing out as she followed Terry to the back of the van. Wayne looked a little ruffled as he opened the double doors, and he grumbled about potholes as he handed Scully her bag. They had packed everything they would need the night before, and Terry hoped it would make them look like hikers if the cops found them out in the woods. "My source said to walk west, and if we come to the road, we've gone too far." "And how far from here is it?" Wayne asked, closing the van and shouldering his pack. "About 2 miles. Scully coughed, smoke curling from her nose as she hacked. 2 miles? Last time we just walked right in. You couldn't have gotten us a little closer, Terry?" Terry tested the straps to make sure they'd be comfortable, the gear inside jostling around. "That was the closest we could safely get. We don't want to get caught, so we're coming in on the far side of the school and walking in. Come on, guys, we gotta get moving." The three moved into the woods, the compass on his watch taking them due west. The Georgia hills were dressed in color, her gold and ambers on display as the trio tromped over the crispy beds of leaves. The birds' song was muted, most of them having already headed for warmer climates, as winter threatened to come rolling in with every crispy morning that dawned. It would not be outside the realm of possibility to wake up to snow on the ground before Halloween. Terry had certainly seen it before. He hoped to be somewhere warm before then, sitting on a beach as he sipped something tasty and laughed at the locals who would be bundled up in their winter clothing. He was sweating under his flannels as the sun grew higher and higher, and Terry thought longingly about the tank top that was in the front of his backpack as he carried on. This was a lot more walk than it had been the first time, but Terry believed it would all be worth it when he came into town without incident. The 6 teens that had started this little lockdown had had a much easier time getting in. The road was blocked by a barricade and a sign telling people not to enter, but they had just stepped over and gone into the town unhampered. Terry had watched the TikTok she had made a few times, saving it to his phone before it was taken off the platform. Heather Johns had shot 8 videos in all, each more troubling than the last. She, Sarah Winters, and Margot Chewell had yet to be found, though Dennis Smith, Francis Johns, and Clive Green had been identified. What was left of them had been, at least. It had all started the last week of September, about 3 weeks ago, and Terry had planned their route very carefully by the landmarks in the videos. In the first video, the teens had laughingly jumped the barricade at 7:30 p.m. as they proceeded into the outskirts of Jeremiah. They had been passing around a flask, as Heather explained that some kids at school had told them about the place and had said it was a cool spot to hang out. They had never been, despite having lived in the area for years, and most of the kids in the area had never heard of Jeremiah. It was an urban legend that none of them really believed in, just a spooky story for sleepovers and summer camp fire pits. She explained that they meant to head to the mines to see if there was anything weird there, and then her 10 minutes had been up and she had told them to catch her on part 2. Part 2 had the kids stumbling through the abandoned streets of Jeremiah. They had passed the post office, a shadowy feed store, and stopped for a few minutes to lounge at an abandoned ice cream parlor. People had pointed out that if you looked behind them as they sat, you could see a shadowy figure lurking, and people had been divided on its authenticity. It was hard to see, but it got easier in the third video. The third video was a selfie at the ice cream parlor, with all 6 of them leaning in as something light played over it. They were all clustered around an odd-looking ice cream character out front, but the weird concrete ice cream man wasn't what people were talking about. The shadowy person was practically looking over their shoulders from the back of the picture, and that was what had sparked the controversy. "Not seeing any foot traffic out here," Wayne said, his hiking boots crunching along through the leaves. "Looks like maybe their patrols haven't quite gone this far." Wayne was an avid hiker, and he knew what to look for when he was tracking things. That was part of the reason Terry had brought him, but the other was that he didn't flake when the shit hit the fan. Wayne had been with him for a while, acting as his cameraman, and Wayne was always steady, no matter what was going on around him. The problem with Heather's video was that it had been shot in the shaky cam of a teenager's cell phone. When Terry got proof, he knew that it would be rock solid if Wayne was behind the camera. "Let's hope so," Terry said. "It'll make it easier if they're too spooked to leave their checkpoint." The fourth video had been about 30 minutes later, and Heather had clearly been reading the comments on videos 2 and 3. Most people believed she was trying to set up some kind of found footage paranormal activity thing, and they had begun to speculate on it with some rather unforgiving comments. Heather told them how she didn't know what that thing had been in the last video, but she was a little freaked out by it. Her brother, Francis, had told her not to think about it, and it was probably just a shadow. That was when they had come up to the Fill and Go, and that had been a lot of the reason that Terry wanted to set up camp there. He hoped that following the kids' bag trail would bring about the best result. The 5th video had opened with the mines, and as that deep pit yawned behind them, the kids had yelled into it, making echoes. Some of the echoes came back strange, sounding high-pitched or distorted, but the kids kept right on yelling drunkenly into the abyss. Some of the boys had started talking about going in, the lights on their phones winking on, but when the beams fell across the smiling face of something waiting just inside the tunnel, Heather screamed and turned away from it. It was quick, less than 3 seconds on the recording, but it definitely fit the description that he'd been given by the old miner. The kids had ran then, the video catching a few of them as their liquid screams cut the night, but their fates were unknown at that point. "I can see buildings," Scully said, and Terry realized that she was right. They had come to a small hill, and below, they got their first look at Jeremiah in 2 decades. It was a squat, ugly sore in the sea of green, and Terry didn't like the look of it one bit. "Let's go," he said. "Looks like we still have about 40 minutes to go." As they headed in, Terry felt his steps getting heavier. He'd been excited by the prospect of the scoop, but now that he was within sight of Jeremiah, it was like being transported back in time. It had been early afternoon when the 3 of them had walked in the last time, less geared but more enthusiastic, and Terry had felt just as nervous then. The school had agreed to give him a section in the paper for paranormal events, and Terry had been curious about Jeremiah since he was young. He had set out to go more than a few times, but he always lost his nerve when he got to the border. It always felt like that barrier was there to keep him out, just as much as it was there to keep whatever was inside. "At this rate, we'll be there before noon," Scully said. That was good, because Terry wanted to set up before dark. The 6th video was mostly a lot of heavy breathing, and Heather begging for help. She was hiding somewhere, a storage room or a closet, and the sound of something scuttling around outside her hiding place was very loud. She peeked out, covering her mouth as she tried to show the viewers what was chasing her. It looked like the same black shape that had been trailing them the whole time. It was moving around on all 4s, seeming to sniff the air as it hunted for her. It was pretty grainy, the quality hard to see because of all the shaking. When it turned to look at her suddenly, she dipped back below the edge of the door, and the video ended. The 7th was a shaky cam shot as the road slid by behind her. Heather was running flat out, the sound of her pursuer hot on her heels. She was crying and gasping, probably not even aware that she was taking video. The few stills Terry had isolated made him think that she was running past the ice cream parlor they had stopped at for the selfie. She wasn't stopping now, though. She sounded ready to drop as she sprinted, and as the timer ran out, there was a single still image of the loping shadow creature coming after her. When he'd shown it to them the night before, bringing Wayne and Scully up to speed, they had looked knowingly at each other. Terry had to admit that whatever the creature was, it looked very similar to whatever had come after them all those years ago. None of them had said it, but it was understood that if they went back, they'd be facing something they had escaped once before. "Just makes us that much more likely to escape it again," Terry had said, his bravado not reflecting how he now felt. As they came into the city limits, Terry reflected on the 8th video as he swallowed his fear. It was only a few seconds, but it was the mouth of the mine as Heather was dragged inside, kicking and screaming by whatever had pursued her. They came to the Fill and Go just as the big clock over City Hall struck 11. The walk in had been far from eventful. The whole place had been deserted, and Terry was ready to duck behind anything at a moment's notice if they encountered police. He had expected to encounter something, but the lack of anything was a little unnerving. The whole town was deserted, nothing but trash to make any noise, and the overwhelming silence was a little unnerving. Terry had expected to have to break into the old shop, but found the door unlocked and the inside relatively clean. "Let's get set up," he said, putting his bag down as Scully set about putting things together in their base camp. She worked on autopilot as she got everything set up. The more things that came out of the bag, the more impressed Terry was with the pack job. With some help, Scully took over the front counter, and soon had an impressive little command center set up. She had an array of small monitors, little more than tablets on small stands, and a laptop that looked powerful enough to control all of them. The case she sat down in front of them was the largest thing she'd packed, and as the laptop began to hum, she patted it affectionately. "While I get set up, I want you guys to set these up," she said, flicking her butt off into the empty store as she fished out another cigarette. "What are they?" Terry asked, popping the latch as he had a look inside. Inside were 6 little bubble cams, like the kind you'd expect to see in a retail store. "There's only a few of them, so use them sparingly, but as long as you put them within the city limits, I can see all of them from here. They've got motion sensors on them as well, so they'll zero in on anything if they sense movement. I'll stay here. You two go get everything together so we don't fall victim to the typical horror movie shenanigans." "And if you get snatched while we're gone?" Wayne asked. She tossed something to Terry, and when he caught it, he saw it was one of those neat little earpieces that you saw in the movies. "Just stay in communication so we can be sure that no one gets snatched." Terry snorted, sliding the earpiece into place. "I guess your gear was worth the rental fee. Come on, Wayne. Looks like we got work to do." They left her setting up her network as they prepared to give it eyes. "You think it's really safe out here?" Wayne asked, boosting Terry up so he could get one of the cameras into the lip of the ice cream stand's awning. "Not in the slightest," Terry said, letting it go gingerly and breathing a sigh when it held. "But neither was that cornfield we were in last week either, the one with the sinkhole, or that weird school where people kept hearing screaming all night." "Yeah, but that was different," Wayne said, looking around like someone who expected to be caught any minute. "The station knew what we were going for there, and knew exactly where we were. I'm guessing management probably doesn't know where we're at right now, do they?" Terry sucked his teeth as he pointed towards the chain-link fence that surrounded Gould Mining Company. "Hey, let's see if we can get one in there. I want to get a camera facing the mine entrance." The gate was padlocked, so the two circled around until they found a piece of fencing that had collapsed near the east side. The mine area was pretty big, and Terry had been certain there would be some sort of way in besides the front gate. The fencing had been set up in the late 60s, and 50-plus years of wear and tear would have taken their toll somewhere. Scully checked in as Terry held the piece open for Wayne, and he answered back in the affirmative when she asked if they were okay. "So that's a no then?" Wayne asked, as they slunk around towards the front. "Sharon knows where we're at, and if Sharon knows, then Bosco definitely knows we're here. If we don't check in by Monday, they'll send someone out to investigate. I'm sure of it." They came up on the entrance of the mine, that gaping maw in the fractured earth, and Terry could almost hear Wayne roll his eyes as he hooked the camera to a nearby shed. Sharon's got a good head on her shoulders, but Bosco couldn't find his morality with both hands. Sharon might make an anonymous call to the police to let them know we're stuck in here. Bosco, however, wouldn't be likely to call the police unless they found our bodies with station IDs on them. Terry saw something interesting then, and grinned as he reached into the shadowy shed and found a pair of bolt cutters that someone had stashed there for God only knows how long. "Then be sure to keep your ID at hand, buddy." Wayne didn't think it was funny, but Terry wasn't much in the mood to reassure him that no boogans were going to come get him. He clearly liked not having to go through the back gate again, and as the new lock broke apart easily, the two headed back into the quiet town. They put the last 4 cameras up pretty much at random, saving one for the fill-and-go. Scully was still there when they returned, and told them the signal from her little plug-in was good. She claimed the uplink was as good as a fiber wire out here, but Terry was just happy to hear that everything would work like it was supposed to. The camera images looked good, way better than the grainy CCTV footage Terry had been expecting, and told Wayne to grab his camera so they could shoot some stock footage. "I thought that was what the cameras were for," Wayne said, pulling the bag out of his backpack and checking the little handheld the station had provided him. It was a far cry from the bulky shoulder setup that they had barely escaped with last time. "This is guerrilla journalism, Wayne," Terry said with a stage wink. "It can be a little rough, but a certain amount of showmanship is still expected." Scully waved at them as they left, the sun already beginning to work its way towards dusk as they went out to get some shots. Terry had Wayne shoot the outside of the ice cream parlor, paying special attention to the table where Heather and her friends had taken their last selfie. Wayne was a pro and needed very little prompting as he worked, which was good because Terry was a little distracted. He could feel an itch on the back of his neck as Wayne went about his work, but he couldn't find any source for it, no matter how many times he checked. It didn't get any better when they went to get some footage from the town, and when Wayne suggested that they go back to the fill-and-go, Terry realized that he was feeling it too. "One more shot," Terry said, the shadows beginning to grow long. "I want one more from the front of the mine." Do we have to? Wayne asked, looking around nervously. It'll be dark soon, and I don't really want to be on the street when it gets dark. Just a quick one. I want to do my promo in front of the mine. Wayne looked like he wanted to argue, but he nodded as the two headed back to the mine entrance, checking in with Scully as they went. Nothing to report yet. I haven't seen anything but you two on those cameras all day. Let's hope that changes come nightfall, Terry said, pushing the gate open as the two came before the black hole again. Yeah, let's not. As much as I could use the extra $3,000, I'll take my 5 and consider it money well spent. Wayne got set up as Terry got into position, putting his back to the opening as Wayne got him into focus. Terry didn't really want to put his back to the mine, but he wanted the shot of the dark hole to be perfect. With the mine as his backdrop, Terry would have a much easier time selling this to the station. The scene from that final TikTok. It was the scene of that final TikTok, the location the girl had unofficially disappeared into, and now Terry was here, on the scene, ready to report. It was well worth the spooky itch he could feel building on the back of his neck again, like someone watching him intently from that dark pit. Ready? He asked, and Wayne nodded as he counted him down. This is Terry Flowers, standing in front of Jeremiah's Folly, the last known location of Heather Johns. Over 20 million people have seen her final video, and speculated on its authenticity. But the fact remains that she and her 5 friends are still missing after... He stuttered a little as something dropped in the mine behind him, and it took everything Terry had not to bolt. It was just an old mine. It made noise. That was all normal. Terry kept repeating it like a mantra as he stood there, composing himself as Wayne counted him down again. The fact that she and 5 of her friends are still missing after coming to Jeremiah. 3 officials have also gone missing searching for them, and it remains to be seen if any evidence can be found of their whereabouts. Wayne was shaking a little, clearly feeling the same pressure that Terry was, and when he told him to cut it, he couldn't help but turn and look into the mouth of that old mine. Did he see something? Perhaps something smiling down there? Let's get back to Scully, Terry said, trying to make it sound nonchalant and failing. Neither of them took their time as they made tracks for the fill-and-go. Terry watched the town slip into darkness through the tinted windows of the fill-and-go. It was heading towards full dark, the squirming terror in his guts fighting with the meal bar he had brought for dinner. The store was beginning to slip into shadows, the only light coming from the laptop Scully sat behind on the front counter. Wayne was checking his phone in the corner, sleeping bag already unrolled and waiting, though Terry doubted they'd be doing a lot of sleeping tonight. Watching the sun sink below the brick edifice, he remembered coming into Jeremiah around this time once before. They had assumed the activity would be higher at night, but they had gotten far more than they bargained for. When the streetlights came on outside the fill-and-go, it wasn't a huge surprise. They'd been on the first time he'd come here, as well as in Heather's TikTok, so he'd figured someone was keeping the lights on. It seemed a little odd to keep the power on in an abandoned town, but maybe it had something to do with its historical status. Perhaps, Terry thought, there was some kind of standard a town had to maintain to keep that status. Maybe the council from Kashmir or Clayton kept the lights on for their own reasons. Maybe some of them remembered seeing shadows of their own when they were kids. "Hey, Wayne," Terry asked, coming to sit next to him as he monkeyed around with his camera, "do you still have that tape from the last time we were here?" Wayne froze in his work, side-eyeing Terry. "No, just couldn't stand having it around. That old VHS sat on my shelf for close to 6 months before I finally just threw it out." Terry wanted to give him an empty platitude about how that was too bad, or maybe they could have used it for stock footage, but he found himself nodding, knowing what Wayne was talking about. "Good. I think I was worried it might still be out there somewhere. When I saw the video thing you showed us, the one Heather made, it reminded me a lot of it. Terry, we could have been that girl. You know that, right?" Terry nodded. "Trust me, I'm very aware." "Then why are we here?" Wayne sounded like he had wanted to ask it before now, but he'd been holding back. It suddenly occurred to Terry that neither of these guys were really here for the money. They had haggled and bickered because that's what industry people did. But they were ultimately here because Terry had brought them here. They wanted to make sure that he was okay, that he didn't go alone and end up as just another statistic. And the realization made him feel more than a little dirty. I don't know, Wayne. I guess when I saw that video, I thought that maybe we could make a difference for this girl and her friends. If anyone would know a way to escape this place, it'd be us. We escaped it, after all. We survived, and I guess I thought that maybe we could make a difference somehow. Wayne was still holding the camera, but he wasn't really doing anything with it. I've dreamed about this place. Every night since we escaped, Terry. The older I get, the harder it is to keep telling myself it was real. But I know what I saw. We know what we saw, Terry. Wayne looked up at him, the last rays of the sun turning his eyes into a kind of reverse mask as they cut through the cracks in the nearby brick building. Terry didn't have to look at Scully to know that she was listening too. Listening and agreeing. They had all seen something here. Something that none of them wanted to talk about. Hadn't wanted to talk about for 2 decades. But it seemed they were in a place where talking about it wouldn't feel so crazy. I hope we were wrong, Terry said, knowing he hoped no such thing. I hope we were just dumb kids who got spooked one night. I hope that Scully's right and it's just a bear that's been bothered by some kids. We should try to get some sleep, Wayne said, putting his camera away. I assume we'll be snoozing in shifts. I think that might be best, Terry said. Scully, do you want me to take the first watch? She shook her head, the smoke making a ghostly ring as it was lit by the computer screen. No, I'll take the first watch. I want to keep an eye on these things here, at least till midnight. I'll wake you up if something changes before then, but you can take the next watch at midnight, and Wayne can have it till morning. Sounds fair, Wayne said, crawling into his sleeping bag as he tried to get comfy on the tile floor. Till then, I'm going to catch a little shut-eye. That hike took more out of me than I thought it would. Terry climbed into his own bag, Scully's bag between them like a barrier. He hunkered deep, but was left with little but the click of Scully's keys and the bear-like snores of Wayne as sleep eluded him. Despite his best efforts, his mind kept chasing its tail back to that evening in October in 2002. The harder Terry tried to push it away, the more it sank its teeth in and held fast. He found himself replaying it again and again, the events flash-burning across his memory like an old bit of film. As his mind slipped off at long last, the memories followed him and played their hellish movie for him as he slept. It seemed like, no matter what he did, he just couldn't escape the folly in Jeremiah. How are we looking, Wayne? Looks good to me, Wayne said, playing with some dials on the camera to get them just right. This thing's heavier than I would have thought. Better get used to it if you're going to work in TV, bud. I'm sure they're only likely to get bigger. Wayne scoffed, hefting the heavy camera as the three trekked in towards the mines. They had pulled their van right up to the barricade, and Terry had paused as he went to take his first step into Jeremiah. This had been a dream of his, a dream he had never quite had the guts to realize, and the feeling of writhing eels was back again. How many times had he stood right here, trying to work up the courage to go in? How many times had he simply turned around and left again, cursing himself for his cowardice? Something wrong? Scully asked, her red hair less gray now, her face less seamed by years of chain smoking. There was a cigarette there, the coal winking as she looked at Terry with concern, but there was still the short menthol she favored back then, not the cowboy killers that she would later adopt. Terry tried to summon up something that didn't sound lame and failed. Never made it beyond this point before. Really? Scully laughed. You talk about Jeremiah the way some of those meatheads talk about girls they've been with. I expected you would have explored every supple inch of this beauty. Terry laughed. I guess I was just waiting for someone who wanted to come with me. None of my friends ever wanted to make the drive out here. Well, here we are. So let's go in and see what all the fuss is about, she said, linking arms with them and leading them into the dead town like Dorothy leading her friends to the Emerald City. Terry smiled, but he felt bad about lying to her. Friends. Terry had never had any friends, adventurous or otherwise. Terry was a weirdo who had spent most of his school years sitting alone with his books. He had developed an interest in journalism in high school, but he lived amongst the AV Club outcasts like a pariah amongst lepers. He didn't think anyone had even known his name until his senior year, when he'd stood in for Brad Cox and hosted the morning announcements on the student-run news show. His personality had really come out then, and he'd been called on to read the news more and more as his final year progressed. Terry had discovered that he could do this, that his shyness melted away when he was in front of a camera, and it had been a no-brainer that he would go on to study journalism when he went to college. Now here he was, with friends to follow him and a scoop to cover, and Terry wasn't going to waste the opportunity. He was here to cover the disappearance of Megan Bradley and Chad Lawson, a hot-button topic considering they'd been their classmates until about a week ago. Everyone just thought the two had eloped when they had suddenly gone missing. It was pretty common knowledge that Megan's father didn't like Chad, and they had been going off to canoodle in secret for the last few months. When Chad's truck had been found on the outskirts of Jeremiah, the town had been searched by the police to no avail. They had opted not to go into the mines, probably not believing the two would have gone down there for a little heavy petting, and had declared the two simply missing. Terry, however, had been studying this very thing for years, and believed there was a bigger story here. The town had disappeared more than a couple of horny college students, and Terry had delusions about discovering something big here that he could report on, something to make a name for himself. What news outlet wouldn't want him if he blew the lid off of whatever it was here? He might even get invited to work for one of the big ones in Atlanta, something that could rocket his career damn near to the moon. He pushed the fear and uncertainty down as they came into the town, replacing it with excitement and dreams of things to come. Wayne had been an obvious choice for cameraman, but Scully's offer to come had been a little surprising. Scully wouldn't be able to cut the footage until they got back, but she'd insisted on coming anyway. It had sounded like an adventure to her, and she wanted something to tell her grandkids one day when they asked what she had gotten up to in her youth. Plus, as she put it, they might be in for less trouble with 3 as opposed to 2. 2 guys alone in an abandoned town might give some serial killer the wrong idea, you know, she had ribbed. Neither of them had really taken much convincing. Scully was a good hang, and though she had told both of them about 100 times that she wouldn't date them, both Wayne and Terry held out hope in their minds that she might change. She rounded out their team, making up the majority of their editing team, and Terry was glad that she wanted to come. People might not be so quick to believe Wayne and Terry, guys who had a reputation for following spooky stuff, but Sandra Louise had more sense about her. If she saw something weird here, people might be more willing to accept it. It was getting dark, the sun setting behind them as they wandered into the town. Wayne was shooting stock footage, something for Terry to talk over later, and the whole place looked so unreal to Terry. It was like a living time capsule, some of the buildings being refurbs from the early 60s, and some still being wood and brick from the turn of the century. It was like some strange fake town plopped down in the middle of a strange old town, like a tourist trap within a dated real one. As the trio walked, Terry pointed out buildings he had only seen in photographs or heard about it from accounts. The Buckstar Saloon, the old town hall, the general store with its broken windows, and when Scully stopped them to point out a weird little figure, Terry realized where they were almost at once. It would seem weird to him later in life, but at the time, he thought it was kind of funny. "Do you see that?" Scully asked, and Wayne swiveled a little as he tried to find what she was talking about. "What?" Terry said, playing along as he pretended to look. "Over there! It's like someone squatting down to stay hidden." The trio took a few more steps in the direction of the old Formica booths, and when Wayne saw it, he took a step back as he adjusted the zoom on the camera. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, Terry already creeping up behind them as he tried to make sense of it. "Its head looks off, lumpy somehow," Scully whispered to herself, Wayne still trying to see if he could get it into focus. When Terry grabbed their shoulders and yelled, "Boo!" they both jumped, Wayne trying to juggle the camera to stop it from falling. "What the hell, man?" Wayne called, starting to get angry. "Sorry, guys. Couldn't resist," Terry said, his smile large and disarming. "Let me introduce you to Mr. Freezy." He had seen pictures of the weird little ice cream man, and as they approached him, he could see the peeling paint and saccharine colors of the parlor's mascot as he held up his towering cone in an extended hand. Wayne laughed when he saw the thing, reaching out to touch the smooth head and the peeling paint, but Scully socked Terry in the arm, telling him how it was a jerky thing to do. Terry took the punch good-naturedly, but as the streetlights began to come on, all 3 of them looked up in confused wonder. Terry hadn't expected that, but who exactly expected an abandoned town to have working electricity? "You think someone lives here and maybe turned on the streetlights to scare us off?" Scully asked, looking around distrustfully. "Doubtful," Terry said. "The last full-time resident of Jeremiah left in 1982. He'd been staying to take care of the old records room in the city hall, but he got spooked and cleaned out the records before moving to Kashmir." Terry had talked to the guy, and his story had been less than cheery. He had locked himself in the records room for a whole week as something tried to come in after him, finally leaving once it became apparent what it was after. Come on, let's get to the mines. I want to shoot some footage there before it gets too dark. With the street lights to cut the encroaching darkness a little, the three of them were off towards the Gould Mining Company. The mine had been just as creepy that night as it had been earlier that day. The mouth had been dark and brooding, the hole that could very easily go straight into hell for all they knew. Terry had squinted at it, thinking he saw something, but shaking it off his nerves. Terry told Wayne to get the mouth in focus, and as he moved into the shot, he felt a lot like Robert Stack on Unsolved Mysteries. He had loved that show as a kid, and he wondered if Mr. Stack had ever felt some sort of creepy crawlies on the back of his neck as he put his back to the darkness. The creeping dread he was feeling now made him want to turn, but he forced himself to press on. Behind me is Jeremiah's Folly, the largest mine in the region. It produced some of the most unique gems ever seen, right up until 1918 when the mine collapsed, killing hundreds. The mine lay dormant and brooding for the next 4.5 decades, until the Gould Mining Company took over and began trying to reopen the tunnels. There was a sound behind him, but Terry squashed the urge to look. Mines made noises sometimes, he assumed. It was likely just some rocks that had shifted as his voice echoed down there. There was nothing to be afraid of here. The town was abandoned. But Terry couldn't quite make himself believe that. Not after the stories he'd heard. Mr. Gould would never find the success of those early miners, however. In the 20 years the mine operated, he never pulled a single gem from the earth. Terry could see the eyepiece slipping from Wayne's face, and the look of horror that lay behind it was enough to make the creeping dread spread up his scalp. Okay, Wayne, ha, I said I was sorry for spooking you. I'm trying to do an intro here, and your joke is really... But Wayne's scream cut across him, and he was jerked forward as the big boy grabbed the front of his jacket. Scully was already running, clearly having seen something too, and as Wayne pulled him along, Terry couldn't help but glance over his shoulder to see what all the fuss had been about. Something crashed harshly against the bubble of his dreams, but not quick enough to save him from another look at what had come charging out of the mines to get him. The grinning shadow had opened its mouth full of perfect teeth as it roared at him, and Terry had ran flat out as the three of them headed for the van. Terry opened his eyes grumpily as he glanced around. There was a less than random pounding, the glass shaking a little with every hard chuck, and Terry felt his blood freeze as he looked up at the front door. Wayne was sitting up, the bag pulled against him, and Terry could just see the top of Scully's head as she slid below the lip of the counter. The peak of her dull red hair was quivering a little as she hid. When Terry looked back at the glass, his first thought was that they had been busted. A lone figure was at the door, a silhouette in the dim bulbs of the streetlights, his fist banging on the glass. Terry was scared, but not because he believed that some boogin had come to get him. He thought it was probably a cop who had seen a little glow from inside and found 3 journalists hiding in an abandoned gas station. He'd probably seen Scully before she could get down, and now he wanted to ask them what the hell they thought they were doing here. Terry rustled up out of his bag, realizing the jig was up, and walked confidently towards the door as he pulled out his press badge. Might as well try one last gambit before it all fell apart. Hey there, officer. I'm Terry Flowers with Channel 12 out of Gainesville. We're researching the disappearance of the 6 teens. We didn't mean any harm. If you'll just let us get our things, we'll gladly... But then he got closer, and Terry began to realize that something was off. When the thing smiled at him, that great grin that seemed to stretch across its featureless face, Terry backpedaled and almost tripped over a fallen magazine rack. It stopped banging, but now it was just standing there, grinning from ear to ear, and Terry could see others beginning to crawl closer as they strayed from the light of the harsh street lamps that might reveal them. Scully had come out from behind the counter, gibbering at Terry as she asked him what they needed to do. Wayne was with her, breathing very fast as he silently threatened to hyperventilate. This was so much worse than last time. Terry had no clue what to do. Their only hope was to get out of here, get back to the van, but these things, would they allow them to get away? Would they follow them into the woods? Or would they be stopped by some strange barrier that held them within this town? It was worth a shot, Terry supposed. Let's find a back door or something. Leave the gear for now. We can come back in the morning if we really want to. Right now, we gotta get the hell out of here. He had expected Scully to argue, not wanting to leave all her expensive gear here, but for once, she just nodded and followed behind him. There was a back door, but as Terry pushed it open, He saw a dozen of the shadow creatures turn to look at him from the empty parking lot. "Run!" he yelled, grabbing Scully and taking off towards the old high school. He felt ready to run all 2 miles in a matter of minutes, and he could hear both of them gasping behind him as they followed suit. Something shrieked from the dark store, and Terry didn't dare look this time. He didn't want to know how many there were. He didn't want to think about them just overtaking them and throwing them to the ground. The school came into view at the end of the road, but Terry could almost feel those dark feet rushing up the pavement after him. He put on a burst of speed, the others panting behind him, and he charged into the trees as he passed the old school fence. They had been running for a few minutes when Scully wheezed ominously and fell over in the leaves and pine needles. Terry stopped to help her up, frantically trying to get her to her feet, but when they weren't immediately torn to pieces, he looked back and realized that no one was coming after them. The forest was as silent as the town had been, and Terry laughed as the tears flowed down his face. They had made it. They had gotten out. We gotta go back, Scully croaked, sitting up as she tried to catch her breath. She fumbled at her pocket and pulled out an inhaler, triggering it as she slid the end into her mouth. Terry looked at Scully in disbelief, not quite sure what to make of her statement, before asking why the hell they would want to do something like that. Then he looked around, realizing the answer a moment before she said it. They got Wayne. Terry stood, looking at her for a few seconds, his head slowly turning in negation as he tried to make his lips work. We have to go, Terry. If we hurry, we can get him before they take him too deep. Too deep? Terry asked, his voice dreamy. Into the mines, she hissed, becoming angry with him as she took a step towards him. We have to get him before they drag him too deep into the mines. Terry kept shaking his head, the nest of eels beginning to writhe in his stomach again. This had been a mistake. Terry knew that now. He should never have brought them back to Jeremiah. They had escaped once before. Why had he tempted fate? He was so stupid. They had Wayne, probably his best friend, and there wasn't a goddamn thing he could... When Scully slapped him across the face, he almost fell over. She wasn't some juggernaut, but she had taken him by surprise. His head stayed put after the slap, his breathing coming out in gasps as he looked at her. She was angrier than he had ever seen her, and Terry was suddenly more afraid of her than the shadow creatures that had chased them out. Get your shit together, Terry. We're going back for Wayne, even if I have to drag you back. Come on, move your ass. She shoved him, but Terry dug his feet in as he turned back towards the shadowy town. He couldn't. He hated his own cowardice, but he just couldn't. It was exactly as bad as it had been when he was younger, maybe worse. And now all the excitement that had been there was long gone. He was scared. He didn't want to do this anymore, and the trepidation he had felt as a child as he stood at the border of the town made more sense now. His mind had known there was something here that would eat him up, and it had been right. It had gotten those 2 college kids. It had gotten those 6 teens, and now it had gotten Wayne. If Terry went back, it'd get him too. When Scully pushed him this time, he fell on his face in the leaves, her feet crunching as she walked away. Gutless coward! I'll go get him myself. Don't call me again, Terry. I don't have a single thing for you after this. She stomped off towards the town, the crunching dying away as she disappeared into the woods. Terry lay in the leaves as his tears spilled down his face. He was useless, a shell of a man. He didn't deserve friends like Wayne or Scully. They had protected him that night, dragging him along as he threatened to freeze up, and this was how he repaid Wayne for his loyalty. Who knew what those things were doing to him as he lay here making leaf angels? He wanted to get up and go after Scully, but his body felt like it was made of lead. He had felt like this when the creatures had pursued him last time, but Wayne had been there to help him, and now he was repaying him like this. As he watered the leaves, he tried not to go back to that night, but he couldn't help it. He was powerless before his own recollection, and he slipped into them like a comfortable pair of gloves that holds a spider in one finger. Wayne had grabbed him by the jacket and yanked him forward, saving him from being buried under the charging thing. When Terry looked back as the bigger boy pulled him away from the mine, he had seen the gnashing teeth of that shadowy horror and felt his legs try to cramp on him. It was something he had sworn never to experience again, working on his cowardly paralysis for the rest of his life. But that night, it felt as if Wayne dragged him a mile before his legs began to work. It had been after the fall, Terry remembered. Terry had fallen as they came into the parking lot of the fill-and-go, his cheek scraping against the uneven concrete. His brain was a gibbering mass of sparking wires, the relays severed suddenly and violently, and he felt confident that they would have him any minute. This would be it. He had dreamed of coming here his whole life, and now he'd be just another statistic for Jeremiah. When someone grabbed him by the collar and shoved him forward, Terry was aware that his feet were moving, and Wayne was behind him again. "Move your butt! I'm not leaving you behind!" Wayne gasped. The storefront slid by on rails as Terry ran faster than he had ever run before. He didn't dare look behind him. It sounded like a runaway zoo was coming after the two boys as they sprinted, and when the ice cream parlor slid past, the two ran heedlessly for the distant van. The lights were on, the horn cutting through the silence as Scully honked at them. Now they were running past the general store, the saloon, the town hall, and when they jumped the barricade, Terry tucked his feet up so they wouldn't catch and trip him. He slid into the front seat, Wayne bolting into the back, but Scully was momentarily paralyzed as she stared at the town. Terry looked forward and saw that the headlights had created some kind of barrier for the black masses. Scully's hands shook on the shifter, but she slid it into reverse, the swarm of dark, smiling shadows watching them as they went. They had gone a few miles before Terry felt confident enough to look back and thank Wayne for saving him. Wayne had shaken it off, holding out his fist for Terry to bump. "It was nothing. You'd have done the same for me, right?" "Right," Terry said, bumping his knuckles against Wayne's. He had known that that was a lie, but Terry hoped he could make good on that false promise now. Terry climbed out of the leaves on shaky legs, the eel still nibbling at his guts. He felt like he would rather walk into hell than walk into Jeremiah. But walk he did. The steps became easier as he took them, and by the time the town came into view, he felt steady again. This was the right thing to do. He felt it, and as he peeked down the street that would take him back to the fill-and-go, he knew this was likely where he would die. The street crawled with the creatures, their heads lifted as they sniffed the air. Scully was nowhere to be seen, and Terry tiptoed towards the gas station. The creatures didn't seem to notice him as he snuck along, and Terry began to wonder if maybe they were blind. They didn't seem to have any eyes, none that Terry could see, and the way they sniffed the air seemed to confirm that their eyesight was either poor or non-existent. He could see the parking lot as he rounded the corner, but he could also see 4 tar creatures as they scrabbled around on all fours. The road was narrow. Terry couldn't risk getting in close. If they heard him, they would jump on him, and he'd have nowhere to run. He took a step back, looking for a new direction to take, and that was when a crystalline sound scratched against his ears. Every one of the tar creatures picked their heads up, listening for the source of the sound, and Terry dropped as he grabbed the neck of the bottle before it could give him away. He turned to stare silently into the inky face of the sniffing creature, its midnight skin mere inches from his. Terry lifted the bottle slowly, lifting it up as he tossed it back the way he'd come, hearing the glass shatter against a nearby wall. All 4 of them turned in unison, and as they loped off, Terry scuttled away as quickly as possible. As he entered the convenience store, he saw Scully putting some things in a bag as he pressed himself against the wall, praying he hadn't made too much noise. She didn't chastise him, but she didn't offer him any sort of greeting either. She just tossed him one of the LED flashlights she had packed. He caught it as she took out one of her own, pointing towards the mines as she put a finger to her lips. Scully had clearly determined that the creatures were blind too, and her target seemed obvious as she moved for the back door. He could either follow her or not, but either way, she was going to the mines. She would find Wayne, or die trying. Terry turned and crept after her. He had made the same decision when he left the woods. The 2 of them were out the back and heading for the fence before Terry could talk himself out of it. He had to help. He had to get Wayne back, but they were going to the last place he ever wanted to go. The mines represented the epicenter of all the weirdness for him, and he had no desire to go in there. As they came to the entrance, though, Terry realized that this was the only place the monsters weren't gathering, and he realized it was the only place that was likely to contain his friend. "Let's get in and out," Scully whispered, switching her flashlight on as she walked inside. Sandra, Terry started, but she shook her head. Later. Her beam cut through the darkness as she walked inside. Terry turned his own light on, letting her get a little ahead before he could force himself to follow. The mines accepted both of them greedily. It wasn't until they passed the big metal sign that declared that they had passed into D level that Terry realized how deep they were. That can't be right. Sea level should have been mostly collapsed, Terry said. The tunnels there were almost completely intact. The struts looked new, the walls built up, and the floor was level and free of debris. No tools were present either, so if the shadow creatures were fixing up the mines, they were doing it by hand. Terry couldn't put it past them, but it was still kind of odd to think about. Where are they? Scully whispered, more to herself than anyone else. She moved her light around as if expecting to find one of the eyeless horrors at any moment. Terry was less sure they would encounter any of them down here, but he kept swinging his light, too, for reassurance. The idea of finding one of those things, or having it leap out and grab him from the darkness, made his skin crawl. But, given how many of them they had seen in town, he wondered how many there could actually be. Above ground, likely? If they live in the mines, then night may be their only time to walk around on the surface. They live in total darkness, so I'm guessing light doesn't agree with them. Scully hummed, but it sounded forced. Terry marveled at the work they had done down here and wondered how much had been the miners and how much had been the creatures. This would have taken decades after the collapse, and the deeper they went, the more he expected to find a dead end. Even if it wasn't a dead end, it would be a passage too small to squeeze through, a passage they'd have to shimmy to get around. The creatures wouldn't make it easy for their prey to escape. But then, Terry wondered how often the prey escaped at all. When he stumbled into Scully's extended hand, he jumped a little before seeing her squinting into his flashlight beam. She pressed a finger to her lips as she cocked her head, listening. Someone was coughing up ahead, and it sounded wet. The two put on a burst of speed, emboldened by the silence, as they descended to E level. They found Wayne leaning against a wall, coughing like someone in the final stages of pneumonia. Scully ran to him, trying to get him to his feet, but Terry had been distracted by something littering the floor. His foot had crunched against something white, and he looked down to find bones in various states of decomposition. While Scully tried to get Wayne on his feet, Terry looked around at the Golgotha they had found themselves inside. The floor was white with bones, some powdered and others whole, but as Terry bent down to inspect some of them, he noticed something twinkling beneath the surface. Beneath the bones lay a sparkling gem, the green and red at odds with each other. Terry felt his breath catch in his throat as he realized what he was seeing. He turned and shone the light around the cavern, and the dazzling nearly blinded him. The cavern was full of those gems, floor to ceiling, and the light made a starburst behind his eyes as the beam hit them. Was this Jeremiah's folly? Was this the source of the gems? As Terry swung the light around, Scully yelling at him to help, his light settled on something that wouldn't reflect. Something that seemed the antithesis of the sparkling chamber. The pillars seemed to reach to the ceiling, the surface undulating like tar. Scully hadn't noticed it yet, but Terry couldn't look away once he'd seen it. It breathed as it fluctuated before him, seeming to roll upward before rolling down from the base anew. It was too big to be real, too big to be alive, but it was. Terry didn't know how he knew it, but he knew it. It breathed like Wayne, thick and syrupy. Scully had got him shakily to his feet, coming up to shout at Terry to help her get him out. She turned to see what he was looking at, and she had a front row seat for the wide smile that spread across the mouth of that hateful column. Terry's scream rocketed through the cave, and when he bumped into Scully and Wayne, he remembered to grab hold of his friends so he could help Scully get him out. They hobbled up the tunnel, Wayne gasping and coughing between them. Terry hoped they hadn't done anything too bad to him. The bones in that place had made it pretty clear what had happened to the girl and her friends. Why had they mutilated the boys, though? Was that part of it? Did they only keep the girls? He pulled them up short as a rumbling spread down the tunnel, pressing Wayne against the wall as something thundered towards them. "What are you—" But as she felt the ground shake, the three of them pressed as close to the wall as they could as they killed their flashlights. In the darkness, the shadowy mass came storming in, the tunnel shaking ominously as they descended towards their god thing. There were so many of them. Even though he couldn't see them, Terry could feel their numbers, feel the ground shaking beneath them. There were hundreds, if not thousands, and as the last of them filtered through, Terry felt confident in moving Wayne again. He had put a hand over his mouth as the horde passed by, not wanting to give their position away, and as Wayne coughed against his skin, he'd felt something wet patter against his palm. He shook it off as he turned on their flashlight and proceeded upwards again. Wayne's cough was getting even worse. The closer they got to the surface, the worse it seemed to get, and Terry wished he'd thought to bring some water with him. They should probably have brought a first aid kit, too. What if Wayne had been injured? He thought about stopping to see what they could do for him, but Scully shook her head when he said as much. Do you really want to still be here when those things come back? Terry shook his head, but hoped they'd be out of the cave soon. He breathed a little easier when he saw they were nearing A-level. He could see a small light beginning to build in the distance, and thought they might be coming to the surface again. It was brighter than just the streetlights, though. Terry didn't know how long they had been down there, but he thought it might be the first light of dawn peeking into the black depths of the mine. As they came to the mouth of Jeremiah's Folly, Wayne became dead weight in their arms. He went down suddenly, his coughing becoming frantic as he clutched his throat. He was hacking something up, something dark and viscous. As Terry pounded on his back, Scully tried to see what exactly was coming up, and shook the tar off her hands as it pattered against her skin. What the hell is this? She asked, but Terry could only shake his head. Wayne gasped as he tried to breathe, but the tar was coming out faster than he could pull in air. He slammed against the floor of the mine with a thump, and as he gasped out his final breath, Terry felt his hands sink into his old friend's skin like a rotten pumpkin. His clothes bowed in, his flesh becoming liquid, as Wayne sank into himself. He left little else behind but bones and clothes as he sank into goopy tar, and Scully cried out as she tried to find some way to stop him from liquefying. Terry could only watch in horror as the goop his friend became slithered bonelessly back the way they had come. Wayne's clothes and bones, the only evidence that he had existed at all. The two stood framed in the first light of dawn, Scully shaking as she sobbed, and Terry unable to believe what had just happened. When he tried to help her to her feet, she pushed him off the first time, folding in on herself as she cried pitifully. The second time, she let him help her stand, and the two walked out of the mines like mourners at a wake. The ride back was silent. Scully had left all her stuff at the fill-and-go, not having the strength to haul any of it back. Without Wayne, they would have been hard-pressed to get it all home anyway, and Terry felt numb as they walked through the woods. It was Sunday. He and Wayne should have been going over the night's footage while Scully took some of the choicer stills and saved them for later. They should have been shooting more promos. They should have been spending time together as they relived their friendship they'd had in college. Instead, they had wrapped Wayne's bones in his flannel shirt and were taking him out of this cave and back to civilization. It didn't feel right to leave him down there, not so he could join the others in that dark place. He didn't know what to do with his remains, but Terry thought he might bury them somewhere nice, somewhere far away from Jeremiah. You can drop me off here. They were coming up on one of the interstate bus terminals, and Terry insisted that he could take her home. I need to think about some things. A nice long bus ride would do me some good. He pulled over in front of the bus stop, turning his lights on as Scully slid out of the front seat. What will you do? She asked. We left all the footage behind, and you don't have anything for your story. Probably for the best, Terry said, gripping the wheel as he stared towards home. There's only one story here, and it's one I should have known from the start. What's that? Scully asked, looking mistrustfully at him, sensing he was getting ready to flip this tragedy into something to his advantage. Terry wasn't sure he still had the stomach for anything like this, but he had to put one last story out before he took a long, hard look at his next step, that no one should ever go to Jeremiah, Georgia. He drove away, watching her look after him as he drove towards whatever lay before him.